Wyoming Territory, August 1879. The sun had barely cleared the ridge when Florence Whitlow stood alone beside the church steps, her wedding dress clinging to her in the dry heat, dust clinging back. The guests had all gone home. Her father was angry, her mother mortified. The groom Howard Tolliver had taken one look at her walking down the aisle, turned pale, and muttered something about not being able to go through with it. Then he walked out. "Goddamn coward," her father muttered before slamming the chapel doors behind him. Florence stood frozen, face burning. Her dress had taken 6 months of sewing and every stitch ached now. She was 25, too big for most men's liking, and the whole town had whispered behind her back for years. "That Whitlow girl," they said, "sweet enough, but look at her. No man wants a wife like that." They had been right. Until now, she had held onto the hope that maybe kindness and a good heart could matter more than a narrow waist. She was wrong. 3 days later, she was still at her parents' ranch, barely speaking, spending her mornings in the barn mucking stalls just to escape the silence of the house. Her mother's eyes were red. Her father had not said a word to her since the wedding day. That was when the cowboy showed up. He came riding in from the South Trail, a tall man with sunburned skin, a thin scar on one cheek, and a slow, easy way of moving like he had all the time in the world but had still seen too much of it. "Name's Nolan Dorsey," he said, tugging his hat off when he spotted Florence in the barn doorway. "I was told you folks might need help with your horses. I break and train." Her father came out, gave him a hard look, then nodded once. "You can stay in the bunkhouse." Florence stayed quiet, brushing down one of the mares. Nolan glanced at her but did not stare the way other men did. He nodded politely and went to work. Over the next week, Nolan fixed 2 broken gates, patched the roof on the chicken coop, and gentled a mean-tempered stallion named Rooster. He never spoke much unless spoken to, but he always looked Florence in the eye, and when he smiled, it was more with his eyes than his mouth. One morning, Florence found him sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood into a horse's head. "You always this quiet?" she asked, sitting beside him, still in her work dress. "Takes me a while to warm up," he replied. "But I speak when it counts." She studied the carving in his hands. "That for someone?" He hesitated, then handed it to her. "Was not. Now it is." Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and something in her chest twinged. She looked away quickly. Later that week, 2 children showed up at the edge of the property. A boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 7, covered in dust and scratches. Florence spotted them first, hiding behind a mesquite bush near the barn. "Hey there," she said gently, kneeling down. "Are you lost?" The boy stepped forward, shoulders squared. "Our mama died. We've been walking 3 days. She said to find the Whitlow ranch. Said Florence would take us." Florence's heart dropped. "Who is your mama?" "Helena," the girl whispered. "Helena Pritchard. You helped her once when she was sick." Florence remembered. Helena had been a laundress with a broken rib and 2 babies, barely scraping by. Florence had brought her soup and bandages. That was 2 years ago. She looked up and saw Nolan behind her, watching. "I will take them," Florence said. "Come on, let us get you cleaned up." Their names were Henry and Hattie. Skinny, quiet kids with hollow eyes. Florence gave them her old bedroom and slept in the attic. Her parents did not argue. Not out loud. Nolan started helping with the kids. He taught Henry how to hold a hammer and let Hattie ride the smallest mare around the corral. Florence began to smile again, just a little, when Nolan was near. One afternoon, she found him in the barn, loading hay. "Why are you really here?" she asked. "You ride in like a stranger, but you look at me like you know me." He set the pitchfork down. "I saw what happened. In town. The day you were left at the altar." Her face flushed. "You were there. I was buying supplies. Watched the whole thing from the mercantile. Watched you stand there, proud as hell, even after he ran. I thought, that is a woman worth knowing." She blinked. "So you came here?" "I asked around. Took a while to get the job, but I figured if I worked hard enough, maybe you would talk to me." She stared at him, heart pounding. "You think I am worth all that?" "I know you are." She stepped forward, slow. "People call me fat. They say no man wants a woman like me." "They are fools," he said. "You were strong. You were kind. And you were beautiful. I see it every day." Her breath hitched. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Let me stay. Not just for the horses. For you. For the kids. For whatever life you want." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. Then stay. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. Their lips met soft and sure, like something long overdue. That night, Florence sat on the porch with Nolan. Henry curled against her side, Hattie asleep in his lap. The stars stretched wide above them. I did not think anyone would ever claim me, she whispered. You were never waiting to be claimed, Nolan said. You were just waiting for someone to catch up. She laughed, and he kissed her again, slow and certain. And just like that, everything changed. The first frost came early that year. By mid-September, the mornings had turned sharp, and the wind off the ridgeline carried a bite that sank through cotton and wool alike. Florence had taken to rising before dawn, lighting the stove in the kitchen and filling the house with the smell of cornmeal and chicory. Henry sat at the table still half asleep, boots untied, while Hattie combed her doll's hair with a fork. Nolan stepped inside, shaking the cold from his coat. His hands were red from carrying water. Mare's favoring her back left. Might be a stone bruise. Florence handed him a tin cup. There's bacon and beans warming. You'll need more than coffee if you're going to lift her hoof. He leaned against the counter, sipping slow. Your stitching held on the saddle blanket. Thought you'd like to know. Florence nodded, brushing flour from her apron. I used tighter knots this time. He didn't reply, but his eyes lingered. Not staring, just seeing. Outside, her father worked the east fence line, his limp more pronounced since the cold set in. He hadn't said much since the children arrived, but he hadn't turned them away either. Florence knew better than to expect affection. Tolerance was its own kind of truce. Later that morning, she walked with Nolan along the pasture edge, a basket of apples between them. The trees had fruited heavy this year, and the deer had already stripped the lower branches. You always lived here? He asked, voice low under the breeze. Florence shifted the basket to her other hip. Since I was 6. We came from Iowa after my brother died. Pa thought open air might ease Ma's lungs. It didn't. Nolan waited a beat before speaking. Mine died in Kansas. River fever. I was 12. She glanced at him. That why you started drifting? Had no one left to stay for. They walked in silence, the kind that felt full rather than empty. She picked a crabapple from the ground and tossed it into the brush. Helena wrote me once, she said. Said she'd married a man in Rawlins. But he drank. I sent money when I could. Never knew she told the children about me. She trusted you, Nolan said. That's something. They reached the fence line, where Henry and Hattie were piling stones into a crooked circle. Florence crouched beside them. What's this? A fort? Henry said, squinting up at her. We're the guards. Coyotes can't get past. Florence smiled, but Hattie tugged her sleeve. Can we stay here? Forever. Florence looked to Nolan. He gave the faintest nod. Yes, she said. You're home now. That afternoon, while the wind rattled the eaves, Florence found her mother in the sewing room mending a quilt. The woman's fingers were stiff, but her stitches were even. You need anything? Florence asked. Her mother didn't look up. That cowboy. He's staying. Florence stood straighter. He is. Her mother tied off a thread. He doesn't look like much. He's done more for this place in a month than most men would in a year. Her mother set the needle down. Then don't let him slip. Florence left the room without replying, her heart thudding hard. That night, after the children had fallen asleep under borrowed quilts, Nolan met her by the paddock. The moon carved silver lines across his face. I've been thinking, he said. There's land east of here. Good soil. If I saved enough, I could buy a small parcel. Build something of my own. Florence's breath caught. But I don't want to do it alone, he added. Not anymore. She stepped closer, the barn lantern casting a soft glow against the dark. You asking me to come with you? I'm asking you to decide if this, he gestured between them, is something you want to grow. Florence reached for his hand. I don't want to leave this ranch. Not now. The children need steadiness. He nodded once. Then I stay. She tightened her grip. But maybe come spring we build something here. Together. He traced the line of her wrist with his thumb. That's all I wanted. Their kiss was quieter than the wind through the grass, but it rooted deeper than anything that had come before. Beside them, the horses shifted, the world turning gently on. Inside the house, Hattie stirred in her sleep, one hand curled around the carved horse Nolan had given Florence. Henry snored softly, feet sticking out from under the edge of the quilt. And through the thin walls and the thick silence, the first notes of a new life began to hum. By early October, the cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, rattling in the wind like dry paper. Florence stitched heavier quilts each evening while Nolan added another row of kindling to the lean-to. The children's shoes had worn thin, so she bartered 3 jars of plum preserves for a pair of boots at the mercantile. The woman behind the counter eyed Florence's wide frame, then the boots, and said nothing. Outside, Nolan waited with the mule and cart, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. His eyes flicked to the boots in her arms. They'll last through the winter, she said, placing them beside Henry, who sat bundled under a wool shawl. They'll do, Nolan replied, tightening the harness. You remember Tomlinson? The old blacksmith out by the canyon? Pa used to trade fence nails with him. He passed last month. Widow's trying to keep the forge running. Her hands shake, but she's stubborn. Florence watched a hawk circle above the ridge. She have help. A nephew, green, burns more than he binds. Florence slid onto the bench beside him. Maybe she needs someone who knows how to run a ledger. He flicked the reins, and the cart rolled forward over the rutted trail. You offering to help? If she'll have me. The ride home was quiet but not strained. Hattie hummed behind them, and Nolan's gloved hand rested beside hers on the bench, close but not touching. The wind tugged at her braid. When they reached the ranch gate, Florence leaned forward. Wait! He pulled the mule to a halt. She stepped down and opened the small side gate where the children's stone fort still stood, now ringed with dried leaves. I want to build something here, she said. He watched her from the cart, hat tilted back. You already have. Not just for me. For them. For you. She looked back, I steady. We could add a room. Make space. He climbed down, dust rising around his boots. We'd need lumber. And glass if you want a proper window. She nodded once. Then we'll find it. That night, Florence sat on the edge of the attic bed, running her fingers over a length of muslin. Below, she heard the low murmur of Nolan's voice reading to the children from the old almanac. Pa had given up arguing about it. Nolan had a way of making himself useful without asking. She lit the oil lamp and unfolded a pattern she'd drawn by lamplight the week before. A long skirt lined for warmth. A man's vest cut to her measurements. She didn't sew out of vanity, never had, but she'd learned the value of fit. Her shoulders had grown stronger from hauling feed, her arms broader from lifting Henry when he fell asleep in the field. She didn't want to hide those things. Not anymore. Downstairs, a floorboard creaked. She heard Nolan's boots pause at the stairwell. You still awake? He asked. I'm sewing. He climbed the steps slow, careful not to wake the children. When he reached the attic, he stayed by the door. I don't want to overstep, he said. But I've been offered a small job clearing brush for the Reverdy family. It's 3 days' ride west. She folded the muslin in half. When would you leave? Tomorrow before dawn. Back by week's end. You'll take the rifle? And the mare. Rooster's not steady enough for that trail. Florence nodded, but her hands stilled. I'll be back before the first frost bites deep, he said. I just want to put something in the bank. We'll need it for lumber. She rose and crossed to him, the lantern throwing warm light up the slope of his neck. I don't need money half as much as I need to know you'll keep coming back. He met her eyes. I'm not going anywhere that you're not part of. She reached up, touching the edge of his collar. Then be safe. His kiss was quiet and sure, the kind that didn't ask permission because it had already been given. When he left in the dark, she stood in the doorway and watched until the shape of him disappeared into the trees. Then she turned back inside and began clearing space in the pantry. There would be preserves to make. There would be a new room to build. There would be more mornings, warm with coffee and the sound of boots at the door. She had once been left at the altar, aching in a dress sewn with false hope. But that woman was gone. Now she was Florence Whitlow, keeper of 2 children, partner to a man who met her strength with his own, and builder of a home that had begun not with vows or music, but with quiet kindness and steady hands. And she would wait for him not because she needed saving but because he was hers. The air carried a hush now, like the land itself had drawn in and was waiting. Florence moved through her days deliberately, sleeves rolled past her elbows, her braid tucked beneath a wool scarf to keep out the rising chill. The kitchen smelled of vinegar and clove. She'd pickled the last of the onions, and the jars lined the shelf like small trophies of the harvest. The children's cheeks had gone ruddy from the cold, and Hattie took to wearing Nolan's old bandana around her neck, claiming it kept away bad dreams. 3 days had passed since he'd left. On the 4th, clouds rolled in low and heavy, flattening light across the hills. Florence stood on the porch just after breakfast, watching the ridge where the trail dipped behind the pines. She'd taken to listening for hoofbeats without realizing it. Henry came and stood beside her, his hands full of kindling. "He'll be back," he said, not looking up. "I know," she replied, brushing her thumb across a splinter in the railing. They spent the afternoon mending a draft in the children's room, stuffing wool into the cracks above the window panes. Hattie helped arrange dried lavender under the pillows, insisting it would keep the cold from settling in their hair. "He said the wind could steal your thoughts," she whispered. Florence paused, tucking in the last corner of the blanket. "Did Nolan say that?" Hattie nodded solemnly. "But he said it only happens if you're not loved." The words caught and held in Florence's chest long after the girl had curled into sleep. She sat in the parlor with a cup of tea gone cold, her mending untouched in her lap. The storm came at dusk. Wind swept down from the canyon, sharp and fast. The barn door banged once. Florence bolted upright and pulled on her coat, lantern already lit. Outside, the sky had turned the color of bruised iron. She made her way to the barn, shoulders hunched against the sting of grit in the air. Inside, the horses shifted anxiously, nostrils flaring. She calmed them, her voice low and steady, until the worst of the gusts passed. Then she heard it, a single hoofbeat, then another, muffled by the wind. When Nolan rode into the yard, he was soaked through, his coat dark with rain, a cut above his brow seeping red into his temple. He dismounted stiffly, reins slack in one hand. "Storm caught me at the rim," he said, blinking against the lantern light. "Mule threw a shoe. I walked the last 7 miles. Florence didn't speak. She took his arm and led him into the house. Inside, she stripped his coat from his shoulders, laid it across the stove rail, then pulled a clean cloth from the wash basin. He sat quietly while she dabbed the blood from his face. "Did you finish the work?" she asked, voice steady. "I did. Widow Reverdy gave me dried apples and a wool scarf for the children." Florence pressed the cloth more gently to his temple. "You shouldn't have come through the storm alone. I told you I'd be back before the frost," he answered. She paused, then folded the cloth and set it aside. "You could have waited it out." He met her eyes, and something in his gaze settled deep into her. "I didn't want to spend another night without hearing your voice," he said. They didn't speak again for a long while. She took his hand, led him to the chair beside the stove, and pulled a blanket around his shoulders. Later, after the children were asleep and the wind had softened to a low moan beyond the windows, Florence stood beside the bed she'd made up in the attic. Nolan leaned in the doorway, drying his hair with a towel. "I've been thinking," she said, her hands clasped in front of her. "If we're building that room come spring, we ought to start drawing out the plans now. I've saved scrap wood and a few panes from the old chicken shed. We can make something warm. Something ours." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space without pressing on it. "I want to build more than a room with you," he said. "I want to build a life." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "Then we need to be practical. There'll be taxes next year. And the roof over the root cellar's starting to rot." "I'll patch it," he said. "And I'll pay the taxes. I'm not going anywhere." She nodded once, then stepped closer. "Then I suppose you'll need a proper place at the table. And your name beside mine on the land records." A smile touched the corner of her mouth, the kind that came from deep inside. She reached for his hand. "Florence Dorsey," she said, tasting the name. He lifted her hand and kissed the back of it without a word. That night, he slept beside her, both of them fully clothed and tucked under the same heavy quilt she'd pieced together the winter after her mother's cough turned chronic. His arm lay across her waist, a steady weight that didn't press, only promised. Outside, the wind died down to nothing. The world held still. And in the quiet, she dreamed not of being chosen, but of choosing and waking beside a man who had no need to change her, only to stand with her, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart. The first snow clung to the fence posts in thin, uncertain layers. It fell in the night and melted by noon, but it brought with it the real turn of the season. Days shortened and the air no longer softened by midday. Florence had finished lining the pantry shelves with burlap to hold in warmth and had taught Hattie how to wrap the smaller jars in wool scraps to keep them from cracking when the frost deepened. Nolan had finished reinforcing the root cellar roof using salvaged cedar from an abandoned outbuilding near the creek. He came in late that afternoon, cheeks ruddy from the cold, and tugged his gloves free by the stove. "Reckon I found something you'll want to see," he said, his breath still catching from the wind. Florence set down the jar she was labeling. "If it's another fox den, I'm not keeping kids in the house." He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. "It's from the land office. They had a filing error last month. Turns out that parcel just past the East Ridge, 40 acres, is still available." She wiped her hands on her apron. "That's near the old cottonwood grove. Good soil. Close enough to this place we wouldn't have to leave your folks behind. Far enough for it to be our own. And the children? They'd have their own rooms. I've already measured for it. 2 to the north wall, ours to the south. Porch wide enough for summer meals." She took the paper from him, eyes scanning the lines. "You already drew the plans." "I didn't want to push." She smoothed the edge of the page and looked up at him. "You weren't pushing. You were preparing." That night, she brought the paper to the table after supper. Hattie was asleep in the rocker with her doll tucked under her chin. Henry sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully carving a thin stick with a dull knife Nolan had blunted on purpose. Florence placed the paper in front of Henry. "We're thinking of building a house. Would you want your room facing the trees or the pasture?" He didn't answer right away. Then, without looking up, he said, "The trees. They sound like water when the wind comes through." She met Nolan's gaze across the table. He nodded once. They began hauling stone the next week. Florence's father offered a wagon and a team for the first trip, though he said little else. Her mother handed Florence a bundle of dried sage and a coil of homespun thread. "You'll want this near the hearth," she said. "It keeps the air clean." Florence accepted it without a word. Something had shifted between them, not quite closeness, but not the old distance either. By the time the frost deepened into hard ground, the foundation was laid. Nolan built the frame by hand, using a draw knife and his own quiet focus. Florence managed the rest, hauling water, sorting the salvaged nails, teaching the children how to pack clay between the logs to keep out the wind. They wed on a clear morning in early December. No guests, no lace, just Florence in her wool skirt and a fresh braid, Nolan in his cleanest shirt, and the children standing beside them. The preacher from the next county over came through on his circuit and offered the words without ceremony. When he asked if they had any vows, Nolan looked at Florence and said, "I chose you once. I'll choose you every day." She took his hand, calloused and warm. "Then let's begin." They moved into the new house 2 weeks later. The first night, they lit the hearth with kindling. Henry had bundled himself and cooked potatoes in the embers. Hattie curled up beneath a quilt at the foot of the new bed, too excited to sleep in her own room. Nolan unpacked the carved horse he'd made those weeks ago and set it on the mantel. Florence ran her hand along the windowsill he'd built from sanded pine. "You remember the ledge? You said it would be nice for starting seeds come spring. I didn't think you'd remember." He pulled her close, his arm around her waist. "I don't forget anything you say." They stood in the quiet warmth, the firelight soft against the walls they'd raised together, and listened to the low hum of winter pressing close against the eaves. Years passed. The house settled into the land as if it had always belonged there. Florence planted herbs below the kitchen window and taught Hattie how to tend them with care. Henry built a ladder that reached the loft and spent his evenings sketching animals he saw along the creek. Nolan took work from nearby ranchers in the spring, but always came home before dusk, his boots dusty, his face sun-creased and content. They built a second room when Florence's mother fell ill and needed tending. Her father passed the winter after, quietly and without complaint. The children grew and their laughter filled the rafters. Florence kept the ledger now not because she had to, but because she liked the shape of order in a world that could so easily tilt. Nolan carved a new figure each winter. Owls, horses, once a bear. They lined the mantel, quiet sentinels of time well spent. On the porch one evening, with the scent of warmed sage drifting from the hearth, Nolan rested his hand over hers. "You ever think about that day at the church?" he asked. "Sometimes. Still regret it?" She turned to him, her eyes calm and full. "Not for a second." He leaned in, kissed her jaw just beneath the ear. "Good." The sun slipped below the ridge, and the trees turned to silhouettes against the amber sky. The children's voices drifted from inside, soft and sure. Florence leaned into Nolan's side, her hand resting over his heart. And in that moment, with winter behind them and everything ahead, she knew they had built not just a house, but an entire life, quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in the kind of love that asked for nothing but gave everything.